This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Open up Adobe Photoshop, take a look at the top of the layers panel, and you will see this drop down. These are layer blend modes. And these blend modes have been part of Photoshop since, well, ever since layers were added to Photoshop. Believe it or not, there was a time when layers weren't even possible. And these blend modes have been around since then. But I would bet for some of you, these blend modes are the kind of thing that you're not really using all that much. Like maybe you reach for them every now and then when you're trying to do something, specific or unique in Photoshop, but they're not the kind of thing that you reach for as part of your photo editing workflow. We're going to take just a general look at the blend modes, what they are, how they work, and then I'm going to share with you some practical examples of the things that you can do with them, both technical and creative, in the hope that at least one of the examples that I share with you today makes a difference for you. Throughout this video, I will be using the terms blend layer and base layer. The blend layer is the layer that is being blended. It is the one that you are assigning a blend mode to. And then the base layer is the layer underneath that in the layers panel or the stack of layers underneath the blend layer. Let's jump into Photoshop here and let's take a look at the blend modes. So when you open up the layer blend mode dropdown and take a look inside, you'll notice that the blend modes are not alphabetized. They are grouped. The first two up here, normal and dissolve, these are the normal blend modes. They're called normal because they don't really have any bias or influence. They don't really blend. They just basically sit on top like a Jenga brick or a Lego or something. It's just a stack. But then things get more interesting with the next group. These are the darken blend modes. All of the blend modes in here darken your image, and they darken the image in slightly different ways by prioritizing different things, by focusing on different things. Just know for now that all of these make your image darker. And then the next group is the literal inverse of the darken group. This is the lighten group. Darken is the opposite of lighten. Multiply is the opposite of screen. Color burn is the opposite of color dodge. You get the idea. Next, we have the contrast blend mode group, and all of these blend modes add contrast to your image. They create more separation between darkest tones in your image and the brightest tones in your image. And similar to the other blend modes, each one of the blend modes in this contrast group, they all contribute contrast in slightly different ways, but they all accomplish the same goal of adding contrast to your image. Next, we have the inversion blend group, including difference, exclusion, subtract, divide. I bet most of you probably never even touch these, never even use these at all. They have rather surreal consequences because they invert colors in the base layer from the information that's in the blend layer. And on the surface, at least, they don't appear to be particularly useful, but I'm going to share with you an example or two that demonstrates how these can be used effectively when you're editing. And then finally, we have the composite blend modes: hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. And you'll notice that nothing changes when I roll over these, because what these do is allow you to target specific properties of color in your image. Like let's say you want to target a specific color and change it, but you don't want to affect its luminance or its saturation. You can do that with the hue blend mode. You can like paint that in. Saturation is similar. Except you are not affecting hue or luminance, you're only affecting saturation, and so on. It effectively like breaks that information apart, so you're able to target one property of color in your image and make adjustments to it. And then over here next to the blend mode dropdown, we have opacity and fill. Now these can be used interchangeably to adjust the visibility, adjust the transparency of your blend layer in relation to the base layer and everything that comes underneath. And they can be used interchangeably with most of the blend modes. The majority of blend modes here, it doesn't matter if you set opacity to 50% or fill to 50%. You're going to get the same net result either way. However, there are 8 particular blend modes, 8 specific blend modes. I'll put them up here on screen, where that is not true, where 50% fill looks different from 50% opacity. Opacity and fill do not behave the same way. And these 8 modes are sometimes referred to as the special 8 is what they're called because of this characteristic. And with these special 8 blend modes, you want to be prioritizing fill when you are making your adjustment. When you are adjusting the visibility and the transparency, you want to use fill with those blend modes. And yes, you could use opacity as well, but fill is preferable because fill will oftentimes produce better, more natural looking results than adjusting the transparency and the strength using opacity. And you're gonna see a couple of examples of that coming up in a bit. All right, first example here, let's take a look at how to add contrast to an image using blend modes. And what I recommend doing is come over here to the adjustments panel, throw a curves adjustment layer on top, go to the blend mode dropdown, and then change the blend mode to soft light. I've not changed anything with the curve. I haven't touched it. I haven't done anything to it. I just threw it on top and put this soft light blend mode on it. And as you can see, when I toggle this on and off, the colors are getting more saturated, richer, the whites are getting brighter, the shadows are getting darker. The inherent curve, the inherent bias and influence of that soft light blend mode is being passed through that linear curve. So it's just being passed through as is without any additional adjustments at all. So we're getting a nice soft contrast adjustment that looks natural, more natural than say if we choose the overlay blend mode, which tends to get rather crunchy and is a bit much. Soft light is just a slightly softer version of overlay, hence the name. And because this is a normal blend mode, you can just adjust the opacity of this change, suit to taste, however you want it to be. Now, another option you might consider experimenting with that's a little bit different is to use one of the special 8 blend modes, and that is linear light. Now, linear light is a blend mode that combines the linear burn and the linear dodge blend modes effectively into one blend mode. So when you assign it, you get both at the same time. And this one is more aggressive, but again, because this is one of the special 8 blend modes, instead of doing opacity, we use fill instead. Okay, but what about the inverse? What if you have an image where you have very bright values in your image and you have some very dark values in your image, and that's just not really your thing. Like, you want to bring those tonal values closer together, maybe get a look that's a little more filmic, compress the dynamic range a little bit. Well, there's a really simple way to do that. Again, come over here to the adjustments panel, throw a curves layer on top, and we're going to do soft light once again, but this time, come over here to the preset dropdown in properties and select negative. So now the blacks are at 100%, the whites are at 0%, effectively flipped it upside down, so that now the S curve, the contrast curve of that soft light blend mode has been inverted. We are, pushing up the shadows and pulling down the highlights. Now, you probably aren't going to want to use this at full strength. It's a little bit much, so you probably want to just pull down the opacity some. And when we toggle this on and off, you can see that the image does indeed get a little bit flatter. All right, next example, let's take a look at how to infuse an image with color, how to bake more color into it, specifically create a darker, more moody image with richer color. Come down here to the bottom of the layers panel, open this up, and we're going to create a solid color fill adjustment layer. And let's just go with like a dark kind of bluish purple, something like this. This will be fine. Then once we have this, come up here to the blend mode layer, open this up, come down to color burn. Now, when you first apply this, it's going to look pretty psychedelic and pretty crazy, but obviously we can't adjust that. Now, again, because color burn is one of the special 8 blend modes, we should prioritize fill over opacity. So let's drop the fill down and take a look at what's happening to the image. So we are burning some additional color into those flatter, more shadowy areas. This is what it looked like before, right? But just a little bit of fill. Like oftentimes I find with these special 8 blend modes, usually they don't require anything more than like 0 to 10 or 15%. Anything more than that and it just gets completely out of hand. But if you drop it down, it can look very nuanced, very natural, and it looks better than, let's say, dropping opacity. And opacity just, you see what I mean? Like opacity just doesn't look the same in the shadows. The colors just stay kind of gray and kind of flat. And it's like, yeah, there's a little bit of extra color being pushed into there, but it definitely doesn't look as good as, let's go back to fill, pull this down, and see what I mean? Back to the video in just a second, but first I need to take a break and tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. Squarespace is what I use to publish my own photography website, not because they sponsored this video or other videos on my channel for that matter, but because I truly believe that it is the best tool for the job because you don't need to have any web design experience or coding experience or know anything about this stuff. You just go to Squarespace, you sign up for a new account, you pick whichever template you like, you upload your images, you sort and categorize them however you want, and you're able to build a website by yourself on your own without needing to hire a designer, a developer, or anything like that. You can register a domain, you can start an email newsletter list, you can even sell digital goods and products, downloads, courses, all that good stuff by adding e-commerce functionality onto your website. Whatever type of website you need, you can start building it today by heading over to squarespace.com/Dominey and sign up for a free 30-day trial. And then when you're ready to go live, use my last name, Dominey, to save 10% off a new website or domain. Okay, but what about the opposite situation? Let's say that you have an image that is, like a little bit dim, a little bit muddy, a little bit dark in the shadows and the blacks. It doesn't need any burning. It doesn't need any darkening. What it needs is light. It needs additional light in those shadows and in those blacks to lift them up and push them up closer towards middle gray. You want to soften them up a little bit. Well, obviously there are a variety of ways to do that, but this particular technique is unique because not only are we going to lift those shadows and those blacks, but we're also going to add a little bit of color at the same time. We are going to tone those areas, either for stylistic purposes, or you could also add color to offset color cast. Like if those darker areas have, like a little too much blue or a little too much purple or red or green or whatever it is. And to do that, we're going to use the linear dodge add blend mode. Let's begin by adding, again, a solid color. Let's just go with white. For right now, just pure neutral white, hit OK. Come up here to the blend modes and then choose linear dodge add. Now you're not going to see anything at first, but because this is one of these special 8 blend modes, we need to adjust fill. That's right, not opacity. We need to work with fill. So let's drop fill down all the way. And again, the lower you go, the lower registers of fill always seem to produce the most natural results. I think like somewhere between like 0 and 15%, 20%, somewhere in that region. Okay, now because this solid color layer is white, it is not having any effect on color. It is just simply, lifting up those tonal values and not skewing or shifting the colors at all. But we can change that color to anything else we want. Now, because there is a fair amount of magenta in here, what we could do is do like a little bit of light green, something like this. And notice how that is offsetting the magenta that was in those shadows, in those dark areas. Now, if that's not what you're looking for and you don't like that, well, you can just change the hue. And I can make the shadows and the blacks a little bit warmer by injecting some orange into there. Or I could pull it all the way down to red if I want to further emphasize the magenta that's already in there. Maybe go for blue, something like that. Whatever, you get the point. So whatever it is that you want to do here, you can tone the image and lift those shadows at the same time. And that's a really unique and interesting way to be making that change to an image. Okay, so if you are into landscape photography like I am, or really any kind of outdoor-centric photography, odds are you probably have plenty of images that have a super hot, bright sky in them, right? I mean, and it makes sense why, because that's where the light is. That's where the light is coming from. That's where the sun is. So of course it's going to be the brightest thing. And the problem with that is that whatever the brightest thing is in your image, that is what is going to receive the most attention. That is where the viewer's eyes are most likely going to go. Like if you made a print and put it on a wall, if the sky is the brightest thing in your shot, that is what is going to be most noticeable about it. So controlling the sky and controlling those highlights and those bright tonal areas is really important when editing an image. It's part of the reason why Adobe created a sky mask for Lightroom, because people, need to mask it all the time. But the problem with Lightroom, oftentimes when editing a raw file and trying to control the sky, is that if you pull down those highlights and pull down those whites, you may notice oftentimes those bright values turn a little bit gray. They get kind of dull the further you pull them down, when really what we want is to make those bright tonal areas dimmer, but also richer. We want to retain the color that's in there, not, not make them flatter and grayer. I don't know, maybe you do. Maybe that's, creatively what it is that you're going for. But I think there are certainly situations and times when we just wanted to be dimmer and retain some of that color that's there. Well, there's a really cool way that we can do this in Photoshop using a blend mode. Okay, so here's what you do. Come over here to the adjustments panel again. Let's throw a curves adjustment layer on top. Not going to make any edits to it. Come up here to the blend mode dropdown and change this to multiply. Now, multiply is one of the darken blend modes. It darkens the entire image, and the way that it works is it does exactly what its name implies. It takes, a pixel from the base layer and multiplies it by the corresponding pixel in the blend layer. It multiplies the two against one another, and in doing so, it creates a darker pixel because you're effectively like stacking them on top of one another and multiplying them against one another. So everything in the image gets pulled down and everything gets a little bit dimmer. And as you can see, just when I, toggle this on and off, look at how much of a difference this is making with the sky. It's pulled down, these blues. It's emphasized some of the orange and some of the yellow that's there in the rising sun. And it just looks much, much better, obviously. Now, this can also be used if you have just like an image that feels a little bit too bright, like it feels a little bit overexposed and you just want to push everything down a little bit. Well, just throw a curves adjustment layer on top, set it to multiply, and everything will get pushed down. Now, this is just a normal blend mode, so you can then come up here to opacity and then control how much of this effect you want. Okay, remember the inversion blend mode group from the beginning of this video? Those blend modes where they have a very pronounced effect on color. Colors get really surreal and trippy and psychedelic looking. Well, we can use one of those inversion blend modes to create a look that's a little more filmic. Something that feels a little more like analog film. Oftentimes with like Portra, Kodak Portra, it's kind of known for having, bluish green kind of shadows, and then the highlights are kind of yellowy, kind of creamy looking. Ektachrome, if I remember right, I think it's a little more like reddish, a little more orange in the shadows, and a little more cyan in the highlights. And it's a characteristic of film, and it's something that people oftentimes try to do when they're editing their images, so that so the images aren't just completely neutral, so you don't have just a totally neutral, perfect digital image. Rather, it has a little bit of that toning, a little bit of character. Well, this technique is really interesting. So let's jump in here. Let's add the solid color. Let's go with like a really kind of like dark blue, something like this. Something that would be appropriate for our shadows, kind of like a royal blue color. Let's just park it right there. Hit OK. Now we have our solid color. Come up here to the blend mode dropdown and then change this to exclusion. Now look at what is happening to our grayscale ramp. We have that dark purple, that bluish kind of royal blue down here in the blacks and in these dark shadows. And as we get brighter, as we get up above middle gray, the colors invert. The colors become the complement of this dark blue purplish color. Now, from what I can tell from doing this, the color that is created in the whites and the highlights is sometimes, it's not like the perfect color complement to, the color that you're pushing into the blues and the shadows, but it always looks right. It always feels right. It may not be mathematically perfect, but there's something about it where it oftentimes feels like, the right thing. Now, obviously we can change this to something else. We can open this up and let's maybe go for like a, like a deep forest kind of green color, something like that. So put it right around there and notice what's happening. Now we have that dark green in the shadows, and as we get up above middle gray, it turns more purple, it turns more lavender. So this effect can be applied, obviously, to our images. So let's jump over here to an image, and let's just edit this image again here. Let me quickly add our color, and I'm just going to, again, go with like a kind of like a dark, maybe reddish purple, something like that. Hit OK. Go to the drop down, exclusion, and now, because this is not one of the Special 8 blend modes, we drop opacity instead of fill and bring this down to right around, where it starts to feel appropriate, where it starts to feel, natural and authentic looking. Let's actually do something a little bit different. So we can do something like this. We can add a little more magenta into the shadows. We could push some red into there if we want to. Dark green, something like that. And notice how the sky is now getting more purple, getting a little more pink. And again, we can just drop the opacity here and just, tone this however much we want. Just add maybe just a little bit. One of the things that I really like about this is that, one, you don't have to think about, what the complement of a color is. Sometimes it's a little, you could look up a color wheel and figure that out, but this just handles it for you automatically. And the results can oftentimes look very natural and very creative and very artistic, I think. Very, very pleasant because you have that nice inherent color complement. And this is the kind of thing that you could also use as a kind of like a finishing step, as a finishing layer that you add to an image. Let's say you have a whole bunch of different images, like you have like 10 or 15 images that are part of a project, and you want to pull all of them together and, give them something that makes them all feel connected to one another. Well, this is the kind of thing that you can apply in a very subtle way that gives each one of them, that kind of bends all of them together in the same direction. It's similar to like, let's say color grading like a film, something like that, where there could be outdoor shots, there could be indoor shots, there could be all kinds of shots. Well, you want all of those shots to feel cohesive and together and part of a group, part of a film. Part of the story, right? I mean, you don't want the viewer to get distracted and be like, wow, the color grading on that scene looks completely different than the rest of the movie, and it gets distracting, right? This is one of those like nice, subtle finishing things that you can do just to bring some of that cohesion, to create some of that cohesion between images that were shot maybe at different times of day, different subject matter, whatever it may be. But anyway, the point here was just to show you what's possible with this exclusion blend mode, which is really quite cool, I think, and is a lot of fun to experiment with. So definitely give that a try. Okay, so a common thing that happens in outdoor photography, landscape photography especially, when you go out and you're creating images, like let's say around golden hour, and you're doing so because at that time of day, the light is warm, it's rich, it's glowing and soft, and you get really nice ambiance and, a look and feel with your image. And that's why you're shooting at that time of day. And, you take some images, you come back, you look at them later, and the highlights and the whites, they look kind of gray. They look kind of drab. You're not getting that glowing kind of feeling that you had when you were there in the moment. Light doesn't look like light. In other words, it doesn't feel like, what light feels like when it hits you in the eye, like in the moment when you were out there taking the image. So what we need to do is, give a little more presence and a little more character to the brightest tonal values in our image to make them feel a little more reflective, a little more like light. And this is a technique that is commonly referred to as the Orton effect, and there are numerous different ways of accomplishing the Orton effect. But what I'm going to do here is show you a quick way to do it using a layer blend mode. So check this out. Okay, so we're going to take our base layer here. I'm going to duplicate it, create a new one. And then with this image here, by the way, let me just zoom in really quick so you can see, see how, this was shot at golden hour, and this should look a little more, this should have a little more life, a little more, a little more something going on than what it currently does. So let's make a change to that. So I'm going to come up here to image, go to adjustments, select exposure, going to pull up the exposure just a little bit. Doesn't need much, hit OK. And then we are going to blur this layer. Go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and you can go, it doesn't really matter here. You can, don't go totally wild so that everything is obliterated, but just, somewhere, let's just say right around here. Okay, let's do that. And now come up here to the blend mode dropdown and select lighter color. Now this is really crazy. Now it's gonna look kind of awful at first. But this is interesting to look at here just to see what's happening. So what the lighter color blend mode does is it replaces the brightest pixels in the base layer from the lightest pixels that are up in the blended layer. So the midtones and down into the shadows, they are not affected as much. This effect is mostly concentrated above, the median, above middle gray, up into those brightest values where sunlight, is happening. Now, obviously, we can't really, this is a little too much. We can't really do this. So this is a normal blend mode. This is not one of the special 8s. So we just need to drop the opacity down like so. Like, let's just say somewhere right around here. Zoom in here and just kind of take a look at the texture and the grain. You'll notice that, yes, we are losing, a little bit of texture, a little bit of detail in those areas, but they feel more reflective. They feel a little more like light, and they're glowing a little bit. We're losing a little bit of clarity in those areas, and that is perfectly okay because now they feel more reflective. They feel more like light. So that's the before, and then that's the after. Just a little bit of glow, a little bit of softness added to those bright values so that they don't look quite so perfect, quite so clinical, and they feel a little more like, you're actually standing there, looking at this, a little more like true to life, in other words. All right, I have one more example to share with you here, but before I do that, just want to take a second and say thanks for being here. Thanks for making it this far in the video. If you have found this video to be helpful, please do me a favor and give this video a thumbs up down below. It would help me out, help expose this video to more people. And if you want to hang out with me again in the future, remember to subscribe down below in the video description as well. Okay, so something that can oftentimes happen when, I know I'm especially guilty of this, sometimes when editing, you try to push the tones closer together, push them further towards middle gray by pulling the highlights down, pulling the whites down, maybe pushing the shadows up and the blacks up, and you're trying to, try to do this, in other words. Something that can oftentimes happen is that, yes, the shadows and the blacks might look nice, but then the whites and the highlights are kind of gray. They're kind of dull looking. And so you want to raise the exposure. You want to bring some sparkle back to the image. In musical terms, it's almost like treble notes. It's like some of that high-end frequency. You want to bring some of that back, but without pushing the entire exposure of the image back up again. You're happy with everything else. You just wish it had a little more something in that high end of the frequency scale. Well, this is an effective way to do that. And this is an image of mine that I took out in Oregon from earlier this year. And, these are, meant to be kind of dark and moody and, kind of get this kind of vibe, but it's just, it's just a little lacking in that regard. It needs a little something more. So to do this and to fix this problem, what we can do is come down here and let's duplicate the base layer. And then with this, we are going to go to Image, Adjustments, and we're going to invert it. Now, again, you could do Command-Control-I on your keyboard and invert the layer just the same. And now we get this crazy psychedelic looking thing, which is actually kind of cool. I don't mind it so much. But anyway, that's not what we're after here. So now what we do is come up here to the Layer Blend Mode drop down, and we're going to choose Divide. All of the brightest tones, all the brightest values in the image are now being lifted. They are being targeted directly and being lifted and adding much more life and energy and sparkle, I think is like the best word I can think of. If you look at the histogram here, it is clipping up here at the top. So it is all just a little too bright. So let me just come into this region here and let's drop the opacity so we only get as much of this effect as we want. I still want it to be kind of dim, but not super dim. Let's just put it right around there. Let me come out and take a look at these bubbles here on and off. And so, yeah, we're definitely bringing a little more life into those areas. That's definitely looking better. So that is the before and that is the after. Before, after, and it's just a really smart way to be targeting those brightest values in those images without making a luminosity mask, without making any other adjustments. It just works.